Breaking news out of rural Ohio. Authorities responding to what should have been a routine warrant instead uncovered a scene that veteran investigators say they will never forget. Inside a modest home in Vinton County, deputies discovered 16 children, ranging from just 18 months old to 18 years old. According to investigators, many had spent years living in conditions so severe that several required immediate emergency medical treatment. 2 children were airlifted to trauma centers, while others reportedly struggled to communicate after what officials describe as years of profound neglect. The discovery has shocked not only the local community but investigators across the country, drawing comparisons to one of America's most notorious child abuse cases, the Turpin family. But as authorities continue piecing together what happened inside that house, even more questions are emerging. How could 16 children remain hidden for so long? Did warning signs go unnoticed? And could the criminal charges filed so far be only the beginning? As investigators continue examining evidence, new legal developments involving multiple family members are raising fresh questions about how this case will ultimately unfold. This is everything we know so far. On June 30th, deputies with the Vinton County Sheriff's Office arrived at a residence on Omar Street in the village of Hamden, Ohio. Their visit had nothing to do with child welfare. Authorities were there to serve a warrant connected to an unrelated matter. Instead, what they encountered immediately shifted the focus of the entire investigation. According to investigators, deputies found 16 children inside the home. Their ages ranged from approximately 18 months to 18 years old. As authorities began assessing the situation, they quickly realized this was not simply a case of poor living conditions. Investigators alleged the children had been living in circumstances unlike anything many first responders had previously encountered. According to court documents and statements from Ohio officials, most of the children had reportedly been confined primarily to a single room measuring approximately 12 feet by 12 feet. To understand just how small that space is, imagine an average bedroom. Now imagine 16 people sharing it. Not for a few hours, not overnight, but allegedly as their primary living space. Investigators estimate the room measured roughly 144 square feet. Divided among 16 children, that amounts to only about 9 square feet per child, less space than many people occupy while standing in line. Authorities also reported finding human waste throughout portions of the residence. Several children appeared unable to communicate normally. One 18-year-old reportedly could not write her own name. For experienced investigators, those observations immediately suggested something far more serious than simple neglect. Medical personnel were called almost immediately. According to officials, 7 of the children required hospitalization. 2 were transported by medical helicopter to trauma centers in Columbus because of the severity of their conditions. 1 child was reported to be in critical condition. At that point, the investigation expanded beyond local law enforcement. Medical professionals, child welfare specialists, state investigators, prosecutors, all became involved as authorities worked to determine not only what had happened inside the home, but how long these conditions may have existed. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost described the children as appearing almost feral, emphasizing the profound developmental concerns investigators observed. Meanwhile, Vinton County Sheriff Ryan Kane offered an equally sobering assessment. He said he had seen livestock housed in better conditions. Those statements were not made lightly. They reflected what investigators believed they had witnessed firsthand. Officials also clarified one important point. Despite early speculation circulating online, investigators said they did not find cages inside the residence. However, they emphasized that the absence of cages did not diminish the seriousness of the allegations surrounding the children's living conditions. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation is not simply what deputies discovered, but how little anyone outside the home appeared to know. Several neighbors later told reporters they had rarely, if ever, seen children at the property. One neighbor told the Associated Press that he had never realized children lived there at all. Another recalled seeing several children only once during a yard sale years earlier. She remembered they appeared dirty but assumed they had simply been playing outside. After learning what investigators now allege, she admitted she has struggled with feelings of guilt, wondering whether there had been signs she should have recognized. Those accounts illustrate one of the central mysteries surrounding this case. How do 16 children remain almost completely invisible? Investigators believe the family had become exceptionally skilled at avoiding outside attention. Officials say the children were rarely seen in public. There appear to be few educational records, few medical records. Very little evidence suggesting the family regularly interacted with institutions that might have identified warning signs much earlier. As the investigation continues, authorities are trying to determine exactly how long the children lived under these conditions and whether opportunities to intervene may have been missed. Within days of the discovery, 4 adults were arrested. They include the children's mother, their father, and the children's paternal grandparents. Each defendant has been charged with 16 counts of child endangering under Ohio law. Each count is classified as a second-degree felony. If convicted, those charges carry significant potential prison sentences. All 4 defendants have pleaded not guilty. At this stage of the case, prosecutors emphasize that these are allegations, and each defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. Investigators also stress that the criminal investigation remains active. Additional evidence continues to be reviewed, medical evaluations are ongoing, and authorities have not ruled out the possibility of additional charges depending on what those investigations reveal. Although the arrests marked a major milestone, they also opened the door to a series of difficult questions. How long had this been happening? Did anyone outside the home know what conditions were like? Had government agencies ever received reports involving the family? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, could this have been prevented? Those answers may take months, or even years, to fully emerge. But even before the investigation could begin addressing those questions, the case took another unexpected turn. One of the 4 defendants collapsed while being transported to court. That medical emergency would trigger a series of legal developments that prosecutors, defense attorneys, and the court are still trying to untangle. And depending on the outcome, it could significantly affect how this case moves forward. At first, investigators believed they had uncovered everything they needed inside that home. But as the days passed, the focus of the investigation shifted from what deputies found to how this could have happened for so long without anyone stepping in. And while authorities continued examining the children's conditions, the criminal case itself suddenly took an unexpected turn. Before we continue, if you appreciate factual, in-depth true crime documentaries that focus on verified reporting rather than speculation, like, subscribe, and turn on your notification. It helps us continue covering complex cases like this with the time and attention they deserve. Now, back to the investigation. Just days after the arrests, 73-year-old Gary Siders Sr., the children's grandfather, was being transported to what was expected to be a routine preliminary hearing. He never made it inside the courtroom. During transport, Gary Siders Sr. reportedly collapsed and was rushed to a nearby hospital. Initially, very little information was released publicly. Officials confirmed only that his condition was serious enough to require further medical evaluation. Doctors eventually determined that he needed specialized treatment, unavailable at the local hospital, prompting his transfer to a larger medical facility. Authorities have not publicly disclosed the exact nature of his medical condition, citing medical privacy laws. While that may sound like a routine procedural matter, it quickly created an unexpected legal dilemma. Because Gary Siders Sr. had not been convicted of a crime, Ohio law placed responsibility for his medical expenses on the county, not the state. Normally, that might not generate much attention. But Vinton County is one of Ohio's smallest counties. Its limited budget suddenly became part of the conversation. Prosecutors acknowledged that keeping Siders hospitalized while remaining in county custody would place an enormous financial burden on local taxpayers. The issue wasn't whether investigators believed the allegations were serious. It wasn't whether prosecutors intended to continue pursuing the case. It was a question of resources. According to Vinton County prosecutor William Archer, the county simply could not sustain the potentially enormous cost of prolonged specialized medical treatment while Siders remained incarcerated before trial. As a result, the court modified his bond. Instead of requiring a $300,000 cash bond, the judge converted it into a recognizance bond. That decision allows his release under strict conditions once doctors determine he can leave the hospital. Those conditions include GPS monitoring and continued supervision. Even so, the decision immediately sparked criticism online. Many questioned why someone facing 16 felony counts would be released from custody. Others argued the court had little practical choice given the legal and financial realities involved. Regardless of public opinion, the charges themselves remain unchanged. Gary Siders Sr. continues to face 16 counts of child endangering. Just when it appeared the case might begin moving toward trial, another major development emerged. Gary Siders Sr.'s attorney filed a motion requesting a competency evaluation. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of the criminal justice system. A competency evaluation is not a determination of guilt or innocence. It does not erase criminal charges, and it does not mean someone automatically avoids prosecution. Instead, the court must answer a very specific question. Does the defendant currently understand the legal proceedings well enough to participate in his own defense? That includes understanding the charges, recognizing the roles of the judge, attorneys, and jury, and communicating meaningfully with his own lawyer. If the answer is no, the criminal proceedings cannot continue until competency is restored. It's a constitutional safeguard designed to ensure defendants receive a fair trial. According to defense attorney Dorian Baum, his conversations with Gary Siders Sr. raised significant concerns. He described confusion about the legal process, difficulty maintaining coherent conversations, an inability to explain basic courtroom roles, and what he believed were signs of cognitive decline. The attorney was careful not to diagnose his client. Instead, he argued that qualified medical professionals should evaluate whether Gary Siders Sr. is mentally capable of standing trial. The court agreed to order those evaluations. For now, the criminal proceedings involving him remain tied to the outcome of those medical assessments. Alongside the competency motion, the defense also notified the court that it may consider pursuing a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Although those two legal concepts are often confused, they address entirely different questions. Competency focuses on the defendant's mental state today. Insanity focuses on the defendant's mental state when the alleged crimes occurred. A defendant may be competent but not legally insane. Likewise, someone found incompetent today may never reach the question of criminal responsibility until competency is resolved. Legal experts emphasize that an insanity defense is extremely narrow. It is not based simply on having a mental illness. The legal standard generally requires proving that the defendant could not appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions at the time of the alleged offenses. Whether that argument will ultimately be pursued or succeed remains unknown. At this stage, the court has simply ordered evaluations. No conclusions have yet been announced. While attention shifted toward Gary Siders Sr.'s health, the remaining defendants continued preparing their own legal defenses. None of the other three defendants have requested competency evaluations. Each continues facing the same 16 child-endangering charges. Perhaps the most closely watched among them is Elizabeth Siders, the mother of all 16 children. Through her attorney, Elizabeth has asked the court to reconsider her bond. Her legal team argues she has no prior criminal history, no documented failures to appear in court, and no financial ability to post the original cash bond. According to the motion, Elizabeth would comply with electronic monitoring and any reporting requirements imposed by the court if released. Her attorney also argues that the alleged victims, the children, are no longer in the home. They remain in state custody. Because of that, the defense contends there is no ongoing danger requiring continued detention before trial. Prosecutors have not publicly responded in detail to those arguments. The court has yet to decide whether her request will be granted. As investigators continued examining the family's history, new details emerged that complicated public perceptions of the case. Court records show Elizabeth married Gary Siders Jr. in 2008. She was 15 years old. He was 18. The marriage took place in West Virginia with parental consent and judicial approval, which was permitted under state law at the time. Only 2 months later, the couple welcomed their first child. Over the years that followed, Elizabeth gave birth repeatedly, 16 surviving children, along with another set of twins born prematurely in 2022 who tragically died shortly after birth. Public records indicate she did not continue formal education beyond middle school. There is no public record suggesting she worked outside the home or lived independently after her marriage. Those facts do not determine criminal responsibility, nor do they excuse the allegations now before the court. But investigators are attempting to understand the broader circumstances surrounding the family's history, including how the household functioned over nearly 2 decades. Even Elizabeth's own attorney has publicly acknowledged that the investigation continues to examine every aspect of her role. At this stage, prosecutors have made no distinction between the 4 defendants. Each faces identical charges, Each maintains a plea of not guilty. As national attention intensified, relatives began speaking publicly. Some described the grandparents as once maintaining what appeared to be an ordinary household. Others questioned how the family could have deteriorated so dramatically. One relative claimed the home had once been clean and well maintained. Another suggested years of decline eventually led to the conditions investigators encountered. Those statements have not been independently verified by investigators. However, they raise one of the central questions still facing authorities. If these allegations developed gradually over many years, when did things begin to change? And could someone have intervened sooner? Investigators continue reviewing the family's movements across multiple counties and even another state as they attempt to build a clearer timeline. Officials have also acknowledged reports suggesting previous contact with child welfare agencies. Whether those interactions represented missed opportunities remains part of the ongoing investigation. For now, many of those questions remain unanswered. But investigators believe the timeline leading up to June 30 could prove just as important as the discoveries made that day. And as authorities continued gathering evidence, another experienced investigator, someone who had worked one of America's most infamous child abuse cases, began drawing striking comparisons between what happened in Ohio and a case that still haunts law enforcement years later. Those comparisons would add an entirely new dimension to an already extraordinary investigation. As investigators continued reviewing evidence from the home, another voice entered the conversation. It wasn't a prosecutor, it wasn't a defense attorney, and it wasn't someone looking at the case from a distance. It was a retired detective who had personally led one of the most disturbing child abuse investigations in modern American history. When Thomas Salisbury first learned what investigators had allegedly uncovered in Vinton County, he immediately thought of another case that shocked the nation: the Turpin family. For many Americans, that comparison alone was enough to understand the gravity of what authorities believed they were facing. But Salisbury says one detail in the Ohio investigation may be even more concerning. In January 2018, authorities in Riverside County, California, rescued 13 siblings from conditions prosecutors later described as years of severe abuse, starvation, and confinement. The Turpin parents eventually pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges, including torture and false imprisonment, receiving life sentences. The case became one of the most widely known examples of prolonged child abuse in recent American history. So when news from Ohio began making national headlines, Salisbury immediately noticed familiar warning signs: children spanning a wide range of ages, reports of severe neglect, limited education, little or no medical care, and prolonged isolation from the outside world. According to Salisbury, those similarities were impossible to ignore, but he also pointed to one important difference. In California, despite everything they endured, several of the older Turpin children had secretly tried to teach and protect their younger siblings. They reportedly shared what little education they could. They helped each other survive, and after their rescue, many eventually began rebuilding their lives with extensive professional support. The situation described by investigators in Ohio appears different. Authorities say some of the children were unable to communicate verbally. Investigators also reported that the oldest child, an 18-year-old, could not write her own name. If those findings are confirmed through the ongoing investigation, they may indicate an even deeper level of developmental deprivation. For Salisbury, that possibility is deeply troubling, because while physical injuries can sometimes heal, years of interrupted emotional, educational, and social development often require extraordinary long-term care. Although the initial arrests brought immediate criminal charges, investigators have repeatedly emphasized that the case remains active. Medical evaluations of the children are still ongoing. Those examinations are expected to play a significant role in determining whether additional criminal charges may be appropriate. Right now, each of the 4 defendants faces 16 counts of child endangering. But legal experts note that those may not necessarily be the final charges filed. In complex child abuse investigations, prosecutors often begin with charges they can immediately support, while continuing to analyze medical evidence, forensic findings, and witness statements. Only after reviewing the full scope of that evidence do they decide whether more serious charges are warranted. That process can take weeks, sometimes months, especially when multiple victims are involved. And in this case, investigators are evaluating 16 children with varying medical conditions. Each child represents an individual investigation. Each medical assessment contributes another piece to the overall picture prosecutors are attempting to assemble. Several legal observers have questioned whether child endangering charges alone fully capture the allegations described by investigators. Those questions stem largely from the reported conditions inside the home. According to officials, several children required immediate hospitalization. 2 were airlifted to trauma centers. 1 remained in critical condition after being rescued. Investigators also allege prolonged confinement inside a severely overcrowded room. While prosecutors have not announced any additional charges, experts familiar with similar cases note that investigations of this nature sometimes expand as more evidence becomes available. Charges involving unlawful restraint or other serious offenses are evaluated based on specific legal standards and the evidence ultimately gathered. For now, however, authorities have made no public announcement indicating that such charges will be filed. Instead, they continue emphasizing that the investigation remains ongoing. Every medical report, every interview, every piece of physical evidence, all of it will help determine what prosecutors believe they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Unlike many criminal investigations that involve a single victim, this case presents an enormous logistical challenge. 16 children, multiple hospitals, multiple medical specialists, behavioral health evaluations, forensic interviews, and investigators attempting to reconstruct years of family history. That takes time. It also requires significant resources. Vinton County is a relatively small jurisdiction. Cases of this magnitude are rare. Recognizing that reality, Ohio officials brought in additional legal support to assist local prosecutors. The Attorney General's office assigned an experienced assistant attorney general with substantial background in child abuse prosecutions. A prosecutor from neighboring Highland County was also appointed to help manage the case. According to local officials, these appointments are intended to strengthen, not replace, the existing prosecution team. The case remains under Vinton County's authority, but additional personnel provide expertise necessary for an investigation involving this many alleged victims. Officials have also noted that similar assistance is routinely provided throughout Ohio when particularly large or complex criminal cases arise. Another factor slowing the legal process is the structure of Vinton County's court system itself. Unlike larger counties where grand juries meet frequently, Vinton County convenes grand juries only periodically because of its relatively small caseload. That means formal indictments may not occur immediately. Meanwhile, all 4 defendants waived their preliminary hearings. Legally, that decision means prosecutors are not required to publicly present detailed evidence at this early stage. As a result, much of what investigators know has not yet been disclosed in open court. For the public, that can create frustration. Many questions remain unanswered, but for investigators, limiting the release of evidence is common practice while an active investigation continues. Protecting witness testimony, preserving forensic evidence, and avoiding unnecessary prejudice before trial are all important considerations. As the case moves toward a grand jury, additional details may eventually become public. Until then, authorities continue asking for patience as investigators complete their work. Despite weeks of investigation, many of the most significant questions still do not have clear answers. Exactly how long were the children living under the reported conditions? Did anyone outside the household suspect something was wrong? Were there previous opportunities for intervention? Investigators have confirmed the family lived in multiple locations over the years, including outside Ohio. Authorities are reviewing records from those jurisdictions to determine whether prior contacts with government agencies may help establish a clearer timeline. Officials have also acknowledged reports suggesting previous interactions with child welfare authorities. Whether those contacts revealed warning signs or whether critical information was missed remains under investigation. At this point, investigators have not publicly assigned responsibility to any outside agency. Instead, they continue gathering records and interviewing witnesses. Only after completing that process will a more complete picture begin to emerge. While criminal charges remain central to the public conversation, many professionals involved in child welfare believe another issue deserves equal attention: the children themselves. According to Ohio officials, all 16 children are now in state custody. Authorities say they are receiving medical treatment, behavioral health services, and care from multidisciplinary teams specializing in complex child welfare cases. For many experts, however, rescue represents only the beginning. Recovery from prolonged neglect can take years, sometimes decades. Physical health can often improve relatively quickly. Emotional recovery, educational development, learning basic social interaction, building trust. Those challenges often require sustained support long after criminal proceedings have concluded. As Thomas Salisbury has observed from his experience with the Turpin case, successful recovery depends not only on removing children from dangerous environments, but also on providing consistent long-term care afterward. That lesson continues shaping conversations surrounding the Ohio investigation today. And while prosecutors prepare for what could become one of the largest criminal cases in Vinton County's history, another equally important story is unfolding. One focused not on the defendants, but on whether 16 children can begin rebuilding lives that investigators believe were interrupted long before deputies ever arrived at that front door. As this investigation continues, one thing has become increasingly clear. The discovery inside that home was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Behind every court filing, every medical report, and every legal motion is an effort to answer questions that investigators still cannot fully explain. Questions about how this family lived, how long these alleged conditions existed, whether warning signs were missed, and ultimately, whether justice can fully address what authorities believe happened inside that house. At the time of this report, all 4 defendants continue facing 16 counts of child endangering. Each has entered a plea of not guilty. No trial date has been announced. Before the case can move forward, prosecutors must continue presenting evidence as the investigation develops. Medical evaluations remain ongoing. Investigators continue reviewing records from multiple jurisdictions. Witness interviews are still being conducted, and prosecutors have indicated that additional investigative work remains before the full scope of the case can be presented in court. For Gary Siders Sr., the legal process remains tied to the outcome of court-ordered competency and mental health evaluations. Those assessments will determine whether he is capable of participating in his own defense before the criminal proceedings against him can continue. Meanwhile, the remaining defendants continue awaiting the next stages of the judicial process. Like every criminal case in the United States, these proceedings will ultimately be decided inside a courtroom, where prosecutors bear the burden of proving every allegation beyond a reasonable doubt. Although investigators have released significant information, many important details remain unknown. Authorities have not publicly outlined a complete timeline showing exactly when the alleged neglect began. They have not explained how the family's daily life operated over so many years, nor have they disclosed the full extent of the children's medical evaluations. Those findings may eventually become some of the most important evidence in the case. They could influence future charging decisions. They could shape sentencing recommendations if convictions occur. And they may provide investigators with a clearer understanding of how these children survived under the conditions authorities have described. Until then, investigators continue emphasizing that this remains an active criminal investigation. As with any ongoing case, additional evidence could significantly alter the public's understanding of what happened. For many people following this story, the legal proceedings naturally attract the most attention. Court appearances, bond hearings, criminal charges, possible sentences. But those issues represent only one part of this case. The greater challenge may lie far beyond the courtroom. According to Ohio officials, all 16 children remain under state protection. Authorities say they have been placed in safe environments where they are receiving medical care and behavioral health services. Because several children reportedly displayed significant developmental delays, specialists from multiple disciplines are expected to remain involved in their care. Doctors, psychologists, speech therapists, educational specialists, social workers. Each may play a role in helping these children begin rebuilding lives that investigators believe were shaped by years of isolation. Exactly what that recovery will look like remains uncertain. Every child is different. Every experience is different, and recovery from prolonged neglect rarely follows a predictable path. Experts often emphasize that healing involves far more than physical health. Learning to trust, developing communication skills, building relationships, receiving consistent education, understanding the outside world. Those milestones may take years to achieve. Lessons from previous cases. The comparison to the Turpin family has remained part of the national conversation since the first details from Ohio emerged. Not because the two investigations are identical, but because both illustrate how severe child abuse can remain hidden for years. The Turpin case also demonstrated another important lesson. Rescue alone does not guarantee recovery. In the years following that investigation, concerns emerged regarding some aspects of post-rescue care provided to several Turpin siblings. Those experiences prompted renewed discussions among child welfare professionals about the importance of long-term support after children leave abusive environments. Retired Detective Thomas Salisbury has repeatedly emphasized that point. Drawing from his own experience, he has argued that children rescued from circumstances involving prolonged isolation require coordinated, specialized care, not simply temporary placement, but sustained support. His comments reflect a broader consensus among professionals working in child welfare. Protecting children does not end when an arrest is made. In many ways, that is when the most difficult work begins. Despite weeks of investigation, several questions continue to shape public discussion. How did 16 children remain largely unseen for so many years? Were there opportunities for intervention that were missed? Did frequent moves between different locations contribute to the family's ability to avoid scrutiny? Could additional evidence lead prosecutors to pursue more serious criminal charges? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, could this have been prevented? Those answers may not come quickly. Complex investigations often require months of review, thousands of pages of records, dozens of interviews, extensive medical documentation, and careful forensic analysis. Only after that work is complete will investigators be able to present what they believe is the most complete account of what occurred. Until then, much remains unknown. The next major milestone will likely come as prosecutors continue presenting evidence through the court process. Future hearings may provide additional insight into the evidence collected. Medical evaluations could influence how the prosecution proceeds. Competency findings may determine whether Gary Siders Sr.'s case moves toward trial, and prosecutors will continue deciding whether the existing charges accurately reflect the evidence gathered during the investigation. As always, those decisions will be based not on public opinion, but on the evidence investigators believe they can prove in court. For the community of Vinton County, the case has already left a lasting impact. For investigators, it has become one of the most significant child welfare investigations the region has ever seen. And for the 16 children at the center of this case, the future remains uncertain. Cases like this often leave behind more questions than answers. The legal process will determine whether the allegations against the defendants are proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That process is essential. But regardless of the eventual outcome in court, another reality remains. 16 children were removed from that home. Authorities determined that immediate intervention was necessary. Medical professionals responded. Child welfare agencies became involved. And an investigation that began with an unrelated warrant transformed into one of the most closely watched child abuse cases in the country. As more information becomes available, the public's understanding of this case will continue to evolve. New evidence may emerge. Additional court filings may provide greater clarity, and investigators may answer questions that today remain unresolved. Until then, the focus remains on two parallel efforts. One seeks accountability through the justice system. The other seeks healing for 16 children whose lives have now changed forever. We'll continue following every verified development in this case and provide updates as new information becomes available. If you found this report informative and want factual, carefully researched coverage of major true crime cases, subscribe to Midnight True Crime so you don't miss future investigations. And if you have information relevant to this case, investigators continue asking members of the public to contact the appropriate Ohio authorities. As always, thank you for watching.